So that's me, Roger King. Won't spend any more time on me. If you want to find out a bit more about my life story, come up to me with a drink after the event and I'll freely give it to you. So after all these young chaps and their sexy citizen development and mobile UIs, etc., I'm going to kind of change the direction a little bit here and talk about enterprise work management. So TIBCO is a vendor. Typically, we target the Fortune 500 Global 2000 customer base. We work with very large, typically very frequently with large retail banking organizations such as Citibank, Bank of Montreal, Bank of America, etc. And so, you know, a lot of what we do is targeted at that core marketplace. About four years ago, we completely rewrote our product and started thinking about a lot of the things we'd seen along the way from our heritage as Staffware. What we're seeing now within our customer base is that a lot of them are these, you know, these large banking organizations and other large corporates are retiring a lot of their custom code that may have been backed by a little bit of BPM and really reworking a lot of these core business processes, these core business applications as process-driven applications. And I'm not talking about, you know, the IT management process. I'm talking about the crown jewel processes of the business, which is, you know, servicing loans, giving credit cards, and hanging all of that off the channels as well, involving their partners and customers in the process. So we get involved in a lot of that sort of stuff. And so, you know, the aim of the topic of this today is as we work through that with those customers, of them building these process-centric, process-driven replacement applications for a lot of their custom code today, is that, you know, that there's a big piece of white space out there. You know, you've got your BPMN, you've got your processes. Everybody understands that really well. And we've seen today all about the user interface and mobile apps and all that sort of stuff. So everybody kind of understands that. But there's for the big corporates, there's a big gap, big piece of white space in the middle, which is how is work really distributed? How do I manage privileges, capabilities, privileges? How does all of that factor into the way in which I schedule these user tasks on my very large user community of potentially 30,000 users? And so as we reworked our product, we kind of said, okay, it's not just about process management. Work management is equally important as process management. And so what I'm going to do is use our own product to kind of introduce some of this stuff and then focus very specifically on some of the challenges to that introduced by the large branch network style organizations such as retail banks. So one of the things we kind of got to agree is, you know, what is work and resource management? Well, I think we can kind of agree what process management is. It's well understood. We understand BPMN. It's all about flow, scheduling, tasks and activities, etc. When it comes to work and resource management, what I mean, and I don't want to get into an argument of semantics about how we describe this, is this is all about the way user activities are distributed to and accessed by end users, and how maybe those activities relate to each other in some way, how key business patterns such as 4Is and chaining relate to all of those activities as well. BPMN, participants are abstract. It's down to the runtime engine to implement its own semantics about what it means to schedule a work item to a user. And to be perfectly honest, you know, we've talked about it along the way today, sort of groups and roles, pretty sort of standard patterns for that. Again, as I said, when we come to these large banking organizations, simple groups and roles aren't sufficient for them to manage their work distribution. I'm a big fan, you know, I'm a process geek. I'm a big fan of the work of Wim van der Aalst. Actually, everybody's familiar with the workflow patterns, great piece of work. But personally, you know, I'm a great fan of the resource patterns work here, which is very much related in work management and how that relates to work distribution. And so whilst we reworked our engine, as well as very much focused on the workflow patterns and our ability to support those, we're also very much focused on the work of the resource pattern work and our ability to support that as well. So why is it important to enterprise BPM? Well, it's very simple when you do some basic maths. You know, you take a simple retail banking organization. then simply a 1% improvement in the effectiveness of those resources is worth year on year about $15 to $20 million, and that's kind of a conservative estimate. So financially, it pays off. Effective processes don't in themselves make the resources effective. Okay, you can get people the right things to people, but you don't necessarily make them do the right things, get the right tasks, the right activities matched to the right resources. Getting also matching the work to the right resources is also key around these areas of customer satisfaction, market competitive, customer experience, etc. So what we found is working previously with customers with our previous generation product, as I said, in order to fill this white space, what they might typically do is quite a lot of customization. They particularly put custom activities into the process to do some very kind of work matching and work distribution. And also they would probably build a bunch of customization into the user interface to do additional filtering and queries and correlation on the work items, etc., to bring all this stuff together. And I suspect amongst practitioners out there, you'll notice a similar sort of thing. All that custom code really just becomes a blocker for them being able to really be successful in making process prevalent across the enterprise. That piece in the chunk in the middle is the immovable lump of concrete, that stone that holds the process rollout across the enterprise back.
Researchers have been doing these computer vision techniques now for some time. As we worked through and looked at a lot of this stuff, we said, okay, we've really got to focus on this work distribution, work matching, etc., and try and make sure we can get it controlled by some form of model to kind of bring work management forward to the same level of process management. So without trying to make a product pitch, very nasty, done on an airplane picture by me. But there are kind of two halves of, when we look at work management, kind of two halves to what we've done. So we've, as I said, in terms of the generic capabilities of task matching and distribution, again, very much focused on supporting the capabilities as defined within the Van der Aal's resource patterns. So if you're familiar with the resource patterns, you'll recognize all of these concepts here. In terms of building on that and adding very specific model-driven capabilities, it's about being able to support the organization-based and our own specific capability of RQL-based, which is resource query language, which is a set language for doing very complex tasks to end resource matching capabilities. So as we did all of this, we switched over to from using the concept of queues to using the concept of a completely dynamic work list, which is a filter into the server for all 30,000 users and all hundreds of thousands and potentially millions of work items to provide a very specific to that end user view of the work. Sitting between the generic work list capabilities and LDAP sits what we call the organizational model. Should probably have called it a work model, not an organizational model, but that's just the way it worked out. Because when you say an organizational model, people seem to say, okay, I've got to physically model my organization in your product. Well, why would I want to do that? And I said, no, actually what you're really doing is you're modeling the actual functional model of the way your organization works, the way those teams interact, their skills, their capabilities, all that virtual stuff about your organization that doesn't exist in your LDAP. Your LDAP probably tells you who the guy above you in the hierarchy is, who signs off your expenses. So this is kind of the virtual organizational model, the work model of the business. And really by combining the resource pattern capabilities with this organizational model, which defines the virtual structure, skills, capabilities, privileges, location, resource metadata, then you can do some very complex and very fine-grained control of work distribution, and hence what any user sees. So a lot of the stuff that customers very often frequently built themselves to fill in that white space. So at this point, I'm going to dip out and go to design time.
So if you look here, you can see an org model. To us, say an org model is an artifact that lives within the workspace. It's shared amongst projects. It's shared amongst process developers that they can reference and reuse. The org model provides an overlay over the enterprise infrastructure, such as LDAP, but also presents that sort of virtual view of the functional organizational model. If I kind of drill in, you can see here, this org model actually contains two organizations. An organization is kind of a little bit like an internal sandbox. If I then drill in, you can get a better view. Through the delights of having a Mac, I can zoom it in for you. Can't do that on a PC, can you? Four core concepts. The concept of an organizational unit, which is an organizational unit which can contain positions, and an OU can contain multiple positions, and this hierarchy can continue as you see fit. As you see here, this isn't a strict organizational model. This is a functional view of the organization. There are two other concepts, groups and resources. So you can also define groups, which is potentially how work is normally, up until recently, been used to distribute work. And you can also define resources. So my resource seems to have disappeared, which is it. Oh, I'm looking at the wrong one, sorry. You can define groups, and you can define resources. Over here, on the side here, you can see the palette of organizational units. This is a schema that we provide by default, but the product allows you to define your own schema for what is an organizational unit, what is a position, what is a group, all the attributes and properties and naming conventions that you want to use. So this is the way in which you bring your business vocabulary to the overall model that is used to distribute work and access work. As I say, the resources, you can define resource types. Bear with me here. Resources have attributes. You define resources as having attributes. This is a way in which you can define a map. There's a way post-deployment of mapping these attributes to the LDAP directory or to data within the data model. So this, again, virtualizes your model of a resource away from the underlying directory structure and allows you then to write work distribution queries down to a very fine-grained level based upon attributes of a resource such as location. Another aspect, as you might expect to see in something like a Iraqi-based system, is the concept of privileges. Let me see if I can zoom in on that. The concept of privileges and the concept of capabilities. Privileges are things you inherit through the privilege being associated with an organizational unit or position or a group. And capabilities are really kind of aligned with skills. They get deployed into the runtime, and then they can be associated with resources, such as, you can see here, English speaker, etc. Privileges can have qualifiers, so you can have levels of privilege as well. The interesting thing also, we use the privilege model to not only control the way work is distributed and accessed, but also to control the things you can do within the system. So you can see here I have a privilege, can view global work list. So there's a consistent model between control to features as a control to work. Org model gets deployed to the runtime. So now I switched over to a sort of an administration view. I just didn't check that my session was still running. Yes, it is. So the org model gets deployed to the runtime, and then that structure all gets represented within the system's databases. So then we can combine that with the work list view and generate these very rapidly, with very high volume, a complete view for an individual user into the whole system based upon their memberships, their skill sets, their capabilities, their privileges, and et cetera, combined with any resource patterns that need to be applied. So if you take my little example here, now you can see this replicated within the runtime organizational model, and I can put resources into each of these positions. I can do that manually through a user interface by dragging them from the LDAP directory, or I can run an automated job to populate that based upon an LDAP binding. So basically, you've got the model, which defines the vocabulary that you're going to use for work distribution and access. You've got an image in the runtime into which you place resources. So how do I use it? So let's kind of drop out back to Studio again and have a look at a very simple model. So very simple business process, makes no sense, but it's purely there to kind of show some examples. So a very basic task here called handle claim. Sorry, I'm just gone the wrong way. A very basic task here called handle claim. That's being distributed to the home CSR participant. If you look here, the home CSR is defined by a reference to the CSR within my org model. So kind of a little bit like group or role-based distribution, except all of that is reused. It's a common vocabulary across all processes, all process developers, etc. So moving on a little bit, kind of at the other extreme, and I'm kind of gone from the simplest up to the most complex. If you look at this resource, it's called qualified reviewer. If I go and look at the definition of a qualified reviewer, it's somewhat more complex. This uses a query language for resources we call RQL. Rather like SQL, it's a set language for doing very fine-grained selection of resources. But you can see here that all the operators within the set language have all been picked up from that organizational model I defined. So, you know, the privileges I assign to individual resources, positions, group names, etc. So I can do some fairly complex work distribution there based upon RQL. And they're kind of shades of gray and mixes and match between the two mechanisms. Along the way, also talked about workflow patterns. So if we take a look at our friend make payment here, very simply I'm saying my make payment activity is in a separation of duties with my review activity. So the same participant definition is involved with the two tasks, but I've just applied a simple separation of duty pattern across the two, and it will take that one user out of the set. You see a few other things here related to resource patterns as well. These aren't the full set. These are the ones that just make sense to apply here. So you can see retain familiar, offering versus offer to all versus offer to one, allocation patterns, etc., piling. So things that make sense. So here the resource patterns are applied on the process model as well as on the org model. And finally, at the end here, another little example here, but the interesting, this activity is being delivered through a participant called Langpref. Langpref is actually not a regular participant, but is in fact a performer field. And what that means is that actually, if I look at the script here, I can dynamically build up that RQL string. So I can dynamically build the expression. I can load it out of a database. I can generate it from another application and pick it up completely dynamically as I see fit. So it's all completely dynamic as well. So that's a little bit of that. I'm conscious of time, but I am almost finished. This is where we have to test the technology again. So that's kind of a quick tour through what we call work management. But actually, when you kind of then build on top of that for branch network style organizations, the things get even more significant. So if you take the 3 largest branch networks in the United States, this is what you're talking about in terms of branch numbers. So they're big. So the simple fact is you can't sit there and draw all of those organizational units within your organizational model. You've got to find a different mechanism to deal with that. You need to make things more dynamic. The other challenge you have is that these big corporate organizations, the LDAP structure can change any time beneath you, and you need to be able to cope with that change as well. If you bind your processes directly to the LDAP concepts, it's a very brittle model. Either your LDAP's going to change and break everything, or nothing can move forward at the correct pace. You need the model there to provide the level of indirection away from the corporate directory structure. And at the end of the day, I want to just be able to define a single activity that is scope to my branch and just say deliver it to the manager of branch X. Kind of bringing that into the picture. A little bit of a static model at the top, but I want all of this underneath to be dynamic. I want the branches to appear and disappear. I want the resources to be mapped in and out of those organizational positions within the branch. And then I want to be able to define dynamically how to deliver work into that position within the branch. So, and I am almost finished now, honest. So if we go now and look at this other example here. This organizational model now is slightly different. You'll see here, I've got the concept of a branch office. This is actually a dynamic organizational unit. You can see it's appeared over here in the palette. And that is then bound and referenced to just a regular org model. Okay, you can see there it's just picking up and referencing a regular org model. This regular org model actually has been defined, though, saying this is a dynamic organization, and I have to name something, an attribute I'm saying is what's going to identify this dynamic org model. How am I going to identify them? In the case of my LDAP directory, I've got an attribute called OU, which contains a town value like Paris, London, etc. But it could just as easily be a branch ID as well. So when I've got that guy deployed, into the runtime, you can see here now different org model, but all deployed, and I'm seeing multiple sandboxes here. But there's the top level static directory that we define, okay? But we're here under branch network. Now the system has automatically created multiple instances of that branch model based upon finding instances of that town attribute. So London, Paris, Swindon, Newbury. And those who know me know that's the town in England I live in. Swindon, of course, is the home of the mighty AMX BPM software development team. And you can see down here, actually I'm going to go and use London. You can see down here I've got sales and I've got an agent position here that I've mapped multiple resources to. So if I then want to go and use that and dynamically deliver work into it, I can capture some customer data here, the town variable, and then deliver work to a resource. That resource is still just a regular participant called branch sales agent. However, there's a piece of scoping information that goes on here where I can just map a process variable into that town element I created when I defined my dynamic org model. And hey presto, then I can have a single model. I don't need to care about what lives where. Things can change under the hood, but I can scope the process to a particular branch, etc. that's an example of something having to deal with large branch network structures, but not wanting to bind a lot of the LDAP information to your process model, allow your processes to be completely independent of the corporate directory structure. I have one more slide and then I am done. I'm ready for my beer. So, kind of, what's the summary of my manifesto? So to me, you know, for mass adoption of BPM in these sorts of enterprises I'm talking about, when I talk about enterprise BPM, you know, the model-driven work management and resource pattern stuff is critical. Otherwise, you end up writing so much custom stuff, the solution becomes too heavyweight, too brittle, and doesn't move quickly enough. Actually, it hasn't been an area of focus from vendors. It's not particularly sexy, it's hard, and actually it's very rarely recognized as being important by customers at tool selection time. It very, very rarely comes into play with a proof of concept at sales time. And very little focus on the standards group, and as somebody who thinks that the resource pattern work is a very good piece of work, it kind of seems to have petered out, and it's very, very, very good piece of work. I'm a great believer that the world's going to move towards declarative processes a lot more. And the fact is that as processes become more declarative, the activities have to get more intelligent. You cannot be wiring this functionality into your custom process model when you're using declarative processes. So your activity is going to have to become more important, and this work's going to have to become more important. And that's me done.